During my career, the AESA was the place where I engaged most deeply with people from other disciplines, and it was through our discussions there that my ideas developed most fully. So I want today to thank all of you so much for that engagement. I will focus now on what I and others experienced during years of conservative reaction to both the civil rights movement and the second women's movement, following the election of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States in 1980. I hope my ideas may prove useful to you today. My family was on Cape Cod in 1983 when Barbara Finkelstein, a fellow historian and recent president of AESA, phoned to invite me to a weekend gathering of friends to discuss how we scholars of education were to respond to the government's publication of a booklet titled "A Nation at Risk." I agreed to join the small group, and our discussions were wide-ranging. We jokingly called ourselves the Long Pond Conference because the house was on a place called Long Pond. But we had no agenda, and we published no results, and we never met again as a group. Still, I found that experience profoundly comforting and, in retrospect, important to my future. We were from various educational disciplines, but we all were activists who felt determined not to let our work for the racial and sexual integration of schools and colleges to be reversed by the Reagan administration. Here, among my professional peers, I realized that all of us were stunned by the attack on American schools and universities in A Nation at Risk. But some of us already were planning the AESA's response to the document. I was not one of those. Resilience, I learned, entails immediate action to reaffirm and, if needed, to reformulate one's own agenda. And in the years that followed, each of us from that group contributed in our own way to maintaining the reforms of the 1970s which encouraged school integration. After the government published A Nation at Risk, which claimed that America's technological superiority in the world was endangered by several items, by high turnover rates among teachers, by the fact that 23 million American adults were functionally illiterate, according to the document, what could we, scholars of educational studies, do to prevent a setback to the changes that had taken place during the previous decade? While we mulled over how to proceed on issues of racial and gender integration, we also faced another issue that now agitated the public deeply. Computers, which previously had been limited to large-scale machines, were now being made in compact units for individuals. Sales of personal computers increased each year after 1982. Among the public, however, many were apprehensive. Their fears only increased over the next decades. Once personal computers became available, they said, teachers would abandon their traditional focus on teaching skills of reading, writing, and calculating, and instead they would encourage children to use computers of their own. And how then would children in the future learn such vital skills as ways to calculate and write? So it was not surprising that the immediate reaction to the data cited in A Nation at Risk was a conservative one, to reinforce the need for American children to improve their scores on tests of basic skills, as those skills had been understood by their parents and grandparents. New teaching techniques and new subjects became suspect, and there was pressure for them to be eliminated, or at least to be minimized. From the 1980s on, there was even fear among parents that they might soon find their own skills inadequate for their jobs. And I think in retrospect that it was the fear of the adults that was the most important thing that led them to want to make sure that their children did not suffer from the fact that they were feeling inadequate themselves. Some adults felt their very livelihood was threatened. They felt pressured to learn new skills and to use new technologies, and in many cases they still do. And often the cost of retraining fell on the worker and not the employer. And even those workers who were retiring could no longer look back with pride on their life's work, since many saw their long-praised tasks replaced by computers. In 1991, I was invited to give the keynote address to the annual AESA conference, and my topic was Education as Janus, Two Faces in Conflict. Janus was a Roman god with the ability to look backward and forward. My thesis was that educators have to reconcile two disparate tasks, the one to pass on the culture of the past, and on the other, to prepare students to adopt new ways of thinking and acting. And over time, the tasks seem to have become more conflictual. I'll repeat here some of my arguments. Because so much in society is expected to change, the face of education that looks to the future has increased its influence in my lifetime. It exerts enormous influence over the other face, which looks to the past. The two faces conflict because time is unidimensional, proceeding always into a future that momentarily becomes the present and then turns into the past. Time cannot be saved or stored for future use. Even though we may store images of ourselves, we do not live forever. We are still bound to 24 hours in a day, and 70 years and 10, or more frequently nowadays 80 years and 10, is the measure of most people's lives. And also, and this point I want to emphasize particularly today, because I think this is the moment in time in which we may be at a point where we could make a change in the structure here. We are bound to an educational structure designed originally for a newly industrializing society, where most people went to school for 8 years at most, and then went on to work. At that time, life expectancy for the average person was less than age 60, and people did not understand that the brain continued to develop even as one reached the age beyond adolescence. Since then, we have added bells and whistles to our institutions. But despite these changes, the rationale for educating people has remained the same as it was in the earlier period. A post-industrial society, however, may have different reasons for educating its members than an industrial society. If that is the case, we may need to develop a new balance between the two faces of education, the one facing the past and the other facing the future. The two faces conflict when we provide no rationale for prioritizing the influence of the one over the other. And currently we face a struggle for power between those who champion priority for the future and those who champion priority for the past. In neither case do proponents consider that the purpose of education may have to be more than to prepare workers for the workforce, that the portion of life spent in paid employment by the average person in post-industrial society may be much less than it is now, and that the change in time spent in paid work must to affect the purpose and nature of education. Indeed, the portions of one's life devoted to education may need to increase and may change in terms of the length of years spent at any given time than what we do now. Our task as educators is not only to cope with the task of reconciling the conflict between the two faces, but also to provide the public with more than economic arguments on which to base their decisions about which of the two faces of education should have priority. 5 years after giving that address, I had the opportunity once again to speak to members of AESA, and this time as president of the organization. My speech then was a call for scholars of educational foundations to, quote, educate people to the idea that social issues, unlike technological and scientific ones, cannot be identified, addressed, and solved once and for all. It's probably an idea that we all of us agree to, but don't pay too much attention to the consequences of. The task of policymakers, I said, is to balance the good accruing to all these individuals and groups. That balance can never be maintained for long, however. It needs to be adjusted constantly. And what provides equilibrium in one generation is inadequate in the next. To understand that is to understand that solutions to social problems are always contested. The problems may be ameliorated, but they are never solved. I've used my own writing here to demonstrate how over time my ideas were influenced both by events that supported my beliefs and by those that did not. And what appeared to be setbacks at one moment turned into opportunities later. When the civil rights movement and the women's movement began, we had wanted women and people of color to gain equal access to jobs that were traditional then in our society. We gave little thought to the likelihood that traditional occupations would disappear with the advent of new technologies. We gave little thought also to the possibility that new occupations would challenge the established rights of labor to organize, or that they might employ people from overseas rather than American workers. So there were all kinds of issues that arose over time that we had not considered before. New technologies are good or bad according to how they are used by humans. Many challenge people's roles in society, and some technologies even challenge people's understanding of the meaning of life itself.